Clashes erupt in Venezuela. Opposition leader Juan Guaido takes to the streets in a military uprising against President Nicolas Maduro. A Texas bishop comes to Capitol Hill. This Catholic leader testifies on the situation at the border. We'll hear his story firsthand. The White House responds as a judge blocks an abortion referral rule. And the church in China. The Holy See takes part in an international garden expo, what it means for diplomatic efforts. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, April 30th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining me for news from around the world from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Our top story tonight, a military uprising underway in Venezuela. Opposition leader Juan Guaido took to the streets in a bold and risky attempt to oust President Nicolas Maduro. Troops loyal to Maduro sporadically fired tear gas near an airbase in Caracas, forcing a crowd that quickly swelled to a few thousand to run for cover. Guaido, with the backing of the U.S. and dozens of other countries, declared himself the country's interim president in January. In a tweet, Maduro called today for the maximum popular mobilization to assure the victory of peace. The spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General says Antonio Guterres is watching the situation closely and with concern.
The Secretary General urges all sides to exercise maximum restraint, and he appeals to all stakeholders to avoid any violence and take immediate steps to restore calm.
The spokesman says the UN is also reaching out to both sides. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton says he hopes the uprising will be enough to tip Maduro out of power. White House correspondent Mark Irons asked him why the U.S. hasn't given safe harbor to Venezuelan people.
If you stand with Venezuelans, why isn't the U.S. giving them temporary protected status here?
Look, we have that question under review. Obviously, our hope is that we can get a change in the regime in Caracas as soon as possible.
Bolton says the U.S. doesn't want to send Venezuelans back into what now is even a more dangerous situation in their country. Immigration is front and center today on Capitol Hill. A Texas bishop testified to Congress about the plight of migrants flooding the border. And a Catholic sheriff affirms that many good people are fleeing Central American poverty. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Nearly 100,000 migrants crossed the southern border in March. And that's a 12-year high. The Department of Homeland Security says they're running out of money because of this increase. So much so, the administration plans to ask Congress for more cash. Now, still, the Bishop of El Paso tells me the church is there to help.
Border Patrol released these asylum seekers. And now the Diocese of El Paso is helping roughly 80 a day find food, housing, and showers.
Why are you doing this?
Because we're followers of Jesus Christ, because he taught us to care for the vulnerable ones, for the little ones. We couldn't simply stand back and say, we're going to allow these people with their young children, pregnant moms, families that have no other resource to be left on the streets.
Bishop Mark Seitz tells this House subcommittee about their work. As immigration divides Americans, it also divides Catholics.
These are otherwise good people fleeing desperate conditions, but doing so illegally. And we need to address this crisis.
Arizona Sheriff Mark Napier is Catholic. He warns about the dangers of making the trek to the United States.
People from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras are coming up to this country and they're being victimized horribly in their journey up to this country. And then, unfortunately, once they get to this country, there's further victimization of these people. So there's a humanitarian crisis.
Border Patrol numbers show the majority of people now apprehended at the southwest border are families.
It's undoubtable that the drug cartels are enjoying the fact that our resources are distracted by huge influx of family unit migration.
The United States does allow people to at least seek asylum.
The ones that we're seeing are not criminals. They're people that are simply fleeing and trying to find a place of safety.
The acting Secretary of Homeland Security tells a different committee that the Trump administration will ask Congress for more money. It would be used for extra space to house migrants. The U.S. has caught 361,000 immigrants this business year at the southwest border. Lauren?
361,000. Wow. Thank you so much. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. President Donald Trump announces a plan for sweeping changes to the U.S. asylum process. He wants asylum seekers to pay a fee to apply, and he wants to bar illegal immigrants from receiving a provisional work permit. The White House says not every asylum claim is credible, and it doesn't want people who have a credible claim of fear to be hurt in the process by those who don't. The White House blames activist judges for blocking new rules designed to stop taxpayer money from promoting abortion. Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, tells News Nightly judges should not base their decisions on their own political points of view.
If you want to get an abortion in this country, get an abortion. But the government shouldn't have to pay for that any more than I should pay for Viagra. You shouldn't pay for somebody's abortion.
Conway says she tells President Trump to give family planning money to qualified women's health centers with mammogram machines, which Planned Parenthood does not have. President Trump is working with Democrats to develop a bipartisan infrastructure plan. Both sides want to repair crumbling roads and bridges across the country. But finding the money for it could be a challenge. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Disagreements could flare up soon over how to pay for this infrastructure package. And remember, the country is already $22 trillion in debt. But today's headline, the president and Democrats agreed on something.
We just had a very productive meeting with the President of the United States.
Words we aren't used to hearing. A possible sign Democrats and Republicans in Washington can forget differences and unify to repair U.S. infrastructure.
Our crumbling bridges, our roads in disrepair.
Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, constructs the argument why her boss is the best person to lead the project.
We also have as our president a builder, not a typical politician, so he understands how to repair and construct and plan and execute.
Democrats sent the president their infrastructure wish list ahead of today's meeting.
It's about jobs, jobs, jobs. It's about promoting commerce. It's about clean air, clean water.
Both the White House and all of us want to get something done on infrastructure in a big and bold way.
And the big cost? Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says the president agreed to $2 trillion to fund the project. The question now, how will it be paid for? And what impact would it have on the U.S. debt, which is already at $22 trillion? It's increased over the past 2 years. Yes or no, will any of the debt be paid off?
Whoa. It doubled under the prior 8 years. It doubled. Well, hang on one moment, just a little factoid. It went from 10 to 20.
Larry Kudlow, the White House chief economic advisor, told us Monday President Trump's focus is big economic growth, but he contradicted the president, who has promised to pay down the debt. So will any of the debt be paid off under the Trump administration?
Paid off? No, I don't expect so.
The president did tweet about economic success today, but said if interest rates were lowered, coupled with low inflation, the national debt could start to look small, he said. As for paying for that infrastructure plan, we can expect that to be the focus of another meeting between the president and Democrats in about 3 weeks. Lauren?
Asking the tough questions, White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein resigned yesterday in a letter to the White House. Rosenstein's departure had been expected since the confirmation of William Barr as Attorney General. He intended to leave last month, but Rosenstein stayed for the completion of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. Rosenstein's resignation is effective May 11th. A new era begins in Japan as the Emperor Akihito becomes the first monarch to step down in 2 centuries.
安倍内閣総理大臣の述べられた言葉に
During a somber ceremony today, the 85-year-old emperor thanked the people of Japan. He reigned for 30 years and cites his health for the resignation. Akihito's son became emperor at midnight. The emperor is defined as the symbol of the state and has no political power under Japan's post-war constitution. The Vatican announces a new editorial leadership team for its women's magazine. The change comes following the exit of its previous editor, who said church leaders were on a campaign to discredit the magazine. 3 of the members previously worked for the magazine and stayed on following the resignation of Lucreta Scarafia. and other members last month. The Vatican says a few thousand people stopped by its pavilion yesterday in Beijing during an international fair dedicated to horticulture. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, seen on the right, and Bishop Paul Tai on the left are representing the Vatican. Some items on display at the Holy See's booth include documents from the Vatican Library on herbs and plants. The pavilion was inaugurated the same day the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom released its annual report, citing China's human rights violation as in a category all by itself. Father Bernardo Cevaletta is Editor-in-Chief of AsiaNews and joins us from Rome. Welcome back to our broadcast, Father.
Hi, good evening to everybody.
In the USURF report, which we just referenced, it says the Chinese government continues to persecute all faiths in an effort to sinicize religious belief. And last September, the Vatican and China signed a provisional agreement about the appointment of bishops, which aggravated many Chinese Catholics and Catholics around the world. Does it make sense for this agreement to go forward while China continues to crack down on religious freedom?
We have to think that the agreement was like an answer to a blackmail, because China promised to nominate at least 47 bishops, new bishops, without the agreement with the Vatican. So if this agreement was not signed, there could have been really a schism. Of course, we have not only trying to dialogue with China, but also denounce all these violations about freedom of religion.
Well, 2 days ago, Father, the local authorities in the Diocese of Anyang destroyed huge iron crosses on bell towers of a church. What are Catholics there telling you about this?
It is a terrible situation in Henan, because the Communist Party in China is trying to destroy the crosses, but in order to terrorize people who want to convert to Christianity, because in Henan there is a stream of conversion, a very strong stream of conversions. So this is why they destroy crosses, they close churches, they chase priests, underground priests, and they don't want them to celebrate masses and so on, because they want to reduce to zero the presence of the church and of religion, of Christianity.
You know, finally, I hear what you're saying, but I want to get your opinion then on why the Vatican is participating in this international horticulture exhibition in Beijing right now. Why are they there? Is this part of diplomatic efforts?
I would say it is a kind, an attempt of cultural dialogue, because the Pontifical Council of Culture it is trying to have relationship with China and China cultural aspects. So this is why they have tried to have an exchange of exhibitions, of art exhibitions, which has not been successful. And now they're trying with this horticultural exhibition.
Well, maybe plant specimens will help with diplomacy. We'll see. Father Bernardo Cevaletta, Editor-in-Chief of AsiaNews. Thank you, Father.
Thanks to you.
Coming up, Pope Francis expresses his sorrow for the victims of another church attack. And the former chairman of a religious freedom commission delves into why the church is under siege. The West African country of Burkina Faso confirms 6 people, including a pastor, were killed in yet another attack on a Christian church. In the past 2 months, places of worship have been targeted in a series of shootings and bombings spanning 4 countries. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby joins us with details from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. No one has claimed responsibility for the latest church attack in Burkina Faso, but jihadist groups have been causing problems in the country and often target foreigners. Today, the Holy Father offered his prayers.
The Vatican confirms Pope Francis is praying for the victims, their families, and the entire Christian community in Burkina Faso. The West African country has been known for promoting tolerance between its large Muslim and Christian populations. But an attack Sunday at a Protestant church now has many on edge. And not just in Africa. Security's up in churches in Sri Lanka. More than 250 people were killed at 3 churches and 4 hotels on Easter Sunday. Following the attacks, Cardinal Malcolm Ranjith, the Archbishop of Colombo, canceled all masses in the country. Today, while meeting with Buddhist leaders, the Cardinal Archbishop announced masses will resume this weekend.
We have planned to have our normal services starting from Sunday, the next Sunday, the 5th of May.
Cardinal Ranjith also welcomed Sri Lanka's temporary ban on face coverings, which conceal people's identities. Like Sri Lanka, New Zealand is still dealing with sorrow after a mass shooting at 2 mosques in March.
Today could have been my funeral.
And now in Southern California, after a gunman fired on Jews celebrating the end of Passover in a synagogue near San Diego. Religious leaders in the U.S. say they need to partner with the government.
Protection of houses of worship. And a plea, and actually written this morning to President Trump and leaders of Congress. Support to make sure that people who come to pray do not have to risk their lives.
The State Department has condemned attacks on places of worship like in Sri Lanka and in New Zealand. In July, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will host a second ministerial to advance religious freedom around the world. The uptick in violence at places of worship is likely to be one of the topics they'll discuss. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Joining me now by satellite from Villanova University is Danielle Mark, Assistant Professor of Political Science and former Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Danielle, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thanks for having me back.
We are seeing this more and more. People killed as they practice their faith in houses of worship all around the world. What do you think is the root cause of this kind of violence?
Well, if we're talking about root causes, the root cause is sin. People have free will and people are good, but they're not all good. And so there are really bad people doing really bad things as always. Obviously, in some of these particular cases we've seen, it's anti-Semitism, which somehow seems to be with us always in every society, right and left. And it's a big problem that we need to address.
Well, Danielle, what's the answer? Is the answer more security in synagogues and sanctuaries?
Well, in the short term, I think that has to be part of the answer. You need good people with guns who know how to use them. Someone shows up, I mean, people are talking about the off-duty Border Patrol agent who was one of the heroes of the story in California, chasing off the assailant, shooting at him. And this is a sad reality. I remember traveling in Europe some years ago and thinking it was necessary but really sad that there were armed guards with machine guns at the entrance to every synagogue. And if you didn't get the right answer to their questions, you couldn't go in. And, you know, it's nice that most synagogues, churches, mosques in America today, you can walk right in, but that may not be a reality for much longer.
So, Danielle, what can we as people of faith do to combat this climate of hate speech that seems to fuel all of this?
Well, as people of faith, I think the first thing we need to do is pray. Obviously, the future is in the Lord's hands, and so that's important for us to remember at all times. But as far as taking action, I think we need to be aware of what's going on, which is unfortunately easier these days with so much bad news in the headlines, but also to speak out and make sure that the kind of hate that we see spreading, the anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, are not normalized. We see, sadly, in the West, an increasing normalization of political violence. No matter how just your cause is, Antifa is a good example. No matter how just your cause is, it is not morally acceptable to employ violence to advance your cause. We learned from Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement the importance of nonviolent political action, and that needs to be an important talking point for everyone who wants to speak out against the attacks we're seeing.
What role does the media play in all of this? Last week's publication of a cartoon had an anti-Semitic image of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the international edition of the New York Times. Now, people are still really upset about that. What does it say that this was published?
You're absolutely right. The media is a huge influencer, And that cartoon, in fact, the New York Times International Edition doubled down. There was a second cartoon the same weekend with Netanyahu, also same general theme as the first one. And the cartoon was absolutely disgusting. I think what we need to think about, though, is not so much the fact that the cartoon was disgusting, but whether we found it surprising. And those of us, people like me who have been following these issues for some time, unfortunately, were not surprised by this. The New York Times and some other media outlets have contributed to the normalization of anti-Semitic violence, sometimes under the guise of anti-Zionism, sometimes in other forms. And it's one egregious act after another, the mealy-mouthed apologies that follow. The reality is, if people are going to continue to adopt these tropes, we're going to see other people thinking that that is then license to act out in these terrible and violent ways. Members of the media need to take responsibility for the influence that they have and the messages they send.
Absolutely. Well, Danielle Mark, thank you so much for joining us. You're the former chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, Medicare for All gets its first formal hearing on Capitol Hill. We'll talk about the implications with the executive director of a Catholic healthcare ministry. And an A+ meeting for the National Teacher of the Year. Congress holds its first ever hearing on a proposal that could phase out private health insurance. The House Rules Committee explored the topic of Medicare for All, a proposal backed by many Democrats and would expand federal insurance programs for older Americans to everyone in the country. Joining me now, Louis Brown, Executive Director of Christ Medicus Foundation, a Catholic healthcare group offering Christians an alternative to traditional health insurance. And you are also a former employee of the Department of Health and Human Services.
Yes.
Welcome back to the broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
Early estimates say this could cost tens of trillions of dollars. You've described this Medicare for All proposal as a disaster.
Yeah, I think it's a disaster. The system's clearly broken. The poor, the uninsured need access to care, but it has a federal abortion mandate in the legislation. It would really increase costs both for taxpayers and the federal government and really crush religious freedom the way it's written. And how do we pay for it? There's no explanation in the current proposals.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said she supports hearings on Medicare for All, but has indicated she wants to build on the Affordable Care Act. And many of the Democratic 2020 presidential candidates are behind this. Is this just politics?
I think a lot of it's politics. You know, there's not the votes in the Senate to pass anything that would expand the Affordable Care Act, or clearly not for a single payer. But it does show what could be coming 2, 4, 6 years down the road.
You know, do you think that the Democrats are doing this so that in the minds of the voters, they, Democrats, are the party of healthcare?
Yes, and I think that's very true, but there's a broader picture to take, right? Yes, we need to provide health care to the uninsured, to the poor, et cetera. It's a good thing to do, but the way they're doing it's not the right way.
Conscience protections are at issue here.
Right, very much so. What the legislation that they have both in the Senate and the House would force doctors to do procedures that many would object based on religion with no exemption whatsoever. There's no way to run over Catholic health care when it provides 25% of all health care to all Americans.
Thank you so much. Louis Brown, Executive Director of the Christ Medicus Foundation.
Thank you, Lauren.
Finally, tonight, the National Teacher of the Year is moved to the front of the classroom in the Oval Office. Rodney Robinson was honored with the National Teacher of the Year award yesterday by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Robinson and other teachers met with President Trump in the Oval Office. The Vice President also stopped by. Robinson is a Virginia educator who teaches at a juvenile detention center. That does it for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly. To all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.